Let's talk Kokedama. It is a Japanese art form of growing a plant without a pot. But if you've been online trying to learn how to do it, you're probably scratching your head or maybe pulling out your hair because there are many ways to make a Kokedama. So today I'm not going to teach you how to, I'm going to teach you why to, so that when you make your Kokedama, it will be a healthy plant and that will make you a happy gardener. Let's get started. Let's talk plants. Not every plant is going to be able to thrive in a Kokedama, so picking the right plant is really important. And the first thing you want to look for is a plant that thrives in the shade. Now, if you're looking at outdoor plants on the tag, it will specifically say shade plant. But if you're looking at indoor plants, they have another word for it. They call it indirect light. And so if you're looking at indoor plants, you want to find one that will thrive in bright, indirect light. And that's exactly how it will be worded on the tag. So an example would be this ripple Peperomia. It likes it rather dry in the soil. It's very slow growing. It has this great, interesting color on the leaves of the plant, and it's a good choice as a shade plant for the Kokedama. Another great shade plant would be this spider plant. It thrives in the shade, but it likes a little bit moist soil. So it's a little bit different in the requirements from the Peperomia to the spider plant. And if you look carefully, you will find this curly spider plant that adds a really nice shape to that round Kokedama ball. Now, whether you get a dry plant or a moist plant, it's really important to know that fact before you start making your Kokedama, because the soil will change. If you have a plant that likes it dry, it's going to have a different texture to the soil than the plant that likes it wet. The next thing to consider is a slow growing plant. If you have a plant that grows really fast, it's going to outgrow the shape of the Kokedama really quickly and cause you to have to repot it more frequently. So you want to choose a plant that is slow growing, like this Pathos. Now, if you're new to Kokedama, you want to choose a plant that is very hardy. And by that, I mean a plant that you can mess with. The plant that's going to tolerate you pruning the roots and messing with the leaves and the stems, because it takes some work to get it in that Kokedama shape. And so a hardy plant like a Pathos really is a good choice. Now, some people think of the Pathos as kind of boring, but there's many varieties of Pathos to choose from. So like this Enjoy Pathos with the great colorations on the leaves, it's a very slow growing Pathos and it would be a great choice. But there's also the Neon Pathos. This one's a little more rare, and it takes on that neon yellow glow, and it would be a very interesting plant in a Kokedama. Now, another one that you might consider is the heart-leafed philodendron, and you can see that mine is actually growing in the same pot with the Pathos because it is the same kind of care, the same kind of water, the same kind of growing requirements for both of these plants. And these are a very hardy, great choice. If you're new to plants and if you're new to Kokedama, getting a hardy plant is really important. The next thing to consider is the shape of the plant. You want something that has a nice, compact shape because it's going to be able to fit into that little round Kokedama ball and not fall over because it's growing long and leggy. So an example would be a begonia. Although it's beautiful and it would look great in a Kokedama for a few weeks, these little canes are going to grow tall and it's going to outgrow the shape of the Kokedama really quickly. So you want something much more compact than the begonia. But another shape option is a trailing plant, because the trailing runners come out of this plant and drape over the side. And you can create your Kokedama with a hanger. And it can actually be a hanging plant with the plant growing out of it and trailing down underneath it. And it makes a really interesting Kokedama. And the last thing to consider is that the best case is a plant that has been newly propagated. A plant that has very small roots on it, like this Pathos that I just propagated a few weeks ago. It has very young roots, about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long. And when I put this particular plant into a Kokedama, it's going to have a lot of room to grow in that little round root ball, which means it's going to be able to stay in that shape in that Kokedama for longer. So to sum it up, you want a plant that thrives in the shade. You want to know ahead of time whether it likes damp soil or dry soil. You want a plant that is hardy, that doesn't mind if you're going to mess with its roots or mess with the leaves of the plant. You want a compact shape that fits nicely with the little shape of that Kokedama ball. And you want a plant that is newly propagated. So there's plenty of space for this plant to grow once you get it into the Kokedama shape. If you follow these little tips, you're going to have a great plant that's really going to thrive in your Kokedama. When you're thinking of soil for a Kokedama, you want to choose a soilless planting medium. And what that means is that there's not actually any dirt in it. There are other components that mimic the texture of dirt, but these components are sterile. So you're not going to have bacteria or fungi growing in your Kokedama. So with a tropical plant like a Pathos or a spider plant or a fern, you need to have a soil that holds moisture very well, because these plants like to be consistently moist. And the two that do that best are the coconut coir, shredded into a fine texture, or the peat moss. And usually the best is a combination of these two. And when you have these components, they act kind of like a sponge, and they hold moisture in the Kokedama so that the plants can maintain a root that is consistently moist. But there's another feature. It likes to be wet, but it doesn't need to be sitting in moisture. So it needs to drain, it needs to hold moisture, and it needs to drain moisture. And what does that is perlite. Perlite is a volcanic rock. It's been superheated so that it pops like popcorn, and it holds air spaces in the soil so that the roots can wrap around the perlite and have access to air while they're also having access to moisture. Now, there are other products. You can use a ground up lava rock or a pumice or a sand. Those work equally well with the Kokedama situation. And then there's one other component, and that is clay. And clay holds the soil together in a nice little ball so that you can work with it as you're putting it into the shape of the Kokedama. And so this is actually red clay, and you can see that it's powdered. There's lots of ways to get clay, and many times it comes in a pellet. And in terms of making the Kokedama, you really want the powder, because you want to mix the powder with the peat and the coir and the perlite, mix it together while it's dry, and then wet it so that it can hold a shape in a ball shape or a teardrop or whatever shape you choose for your Kokedama. And then the other thing to think of is fertilizer, because none of these products have nutrients for your plants. And so you would want to choose either a time-release fertilizer in a granule or use a foliar fertilizer and spray it on the leaves of the plant. And so there are two different ways to do that. When I do a Kokedama, I want it to be very slow growing. And if you don't fertilize it, it slows down that process a great deal. And if you just use a foliar fertilizer, when you notice that the leaves are turning kind of yellow, that's sort of a sign that there aren't enough nutrients in the soil. And so very infrequently, I will spray them with a foliar fertilizer. and that just slows down that growth process. Because usually when I'm making a kokedama, I'm making it to fit the shape that the plant is in right now. And so if it grows much beyond that, it's going to change the whole look of the kokedama. Now, if you wanted it to grow, if you're expecting that this is going to be much bigger by the end of the growing season, then you could put some fertilizer in it and you make your ball a little bit bigger to accommodate the shape and the size of the plant that you expect it to be. So we have selected our plant and we have talked about soil. Let's get down to actually making a kokedama. The first thing to do is to assemble what you're going to need, and I have some latex gloves. You don't have to use gloves, but I find that getting into the clay mud actually makes it more difficult if I don't have gloves on my hands. So that's part of my supplies. I'm going to wrap the kokedama in sphagnum peat. Now, sphagnum is a plant that grows in a bog, and this is the upper part of the plant that grows in the air. Peat moss is actually the roots of the plant. And so we're going to use the sphagnum peat, and it comes in a very dry form. And so we will want to add some water. And the sphagnum really does swell up when it soaks up the water, so you'll need quite a bit of water. You want it to be very, very wet. And it's helpful to just kind of squeeze it and turn it just a little bit and then let it sit and soak up the water. The next thing you're going to need is some twine to wrap it up. You're going to need some scissors to cut the twine. I have my plant, and you want to take the plant out of the soil. You don't want to use normal potting soil in a kokedama because it's not sterile. You need it to have no bacteria, no fungi, nothing that's going to go amok inside that little shape. So I'm going to take it out of the soil. Now, with some plants, you probably will want to soak it in water to actually get the soil away from the roots. But because this is so newly propagated, it's going to be just fine like it is. And I'm just checking each one. I want to make sure that there is a leaf and a stem and a root attached to it. If I have one in here that hasn't rooted yet, I don't want to put it in the kokedama without a root because it may very likely not survive. So the next step is to mix the soil. And you'll find the recipes for the soil in the description, whether you're working with a dry plant or a moisture-loving plant, those recipes are there. But for this Pathos that loves the moisture, I'm going to put 2 parts peat moss, 1 part perlite, and 1 part clay. And I'm going to mix it up while it's dry because I want the clay to be evenly distributed. It's the clay that's going to hold the whole thing together while I wrap it up. And it gets really frustrating when your soil ball doesn't hold its shape. So you want to take a few minutes to really mix that up well. If you have lumps of peat moss that haven't been broken down yet, go ahead and break that down. If the peat moss is a little bit damp, the clay will start sticking to it, and that's fine. But once you get it all mixed up evenly, then you want to add the water. And it's better to add too little than too much, so just add it a little bit at a time. If I were measuring the water, it's roughly 2 parts water in that same size where we did 2 parts peat and 1 part perlite. It would be roughly 2 parts water, but I usually do just a little at a time. Now, peat moss repels water when it's very dry, so sometimes you have to Sometimes you have to actually let this sit for a minute and let the peat moss absorb the water and then add a little bit more water. You want it to be moist enough to stick together in a nice ball, but not to be dripping. When you squeeze it, you want it to hold together nicely. See, this is just still a little bit too crumbly. And once it starts sticking together nicely, sort of like cookie dough, we're just going to let it sit for a minute. And while it's sitting, I'm going to work on the sphagnum. Now the sphagnum, you want to squeeze it out. You don't want to completely have it squeezed dry. You want to squeeze it a little bit so that it doesn't drip, but that it's still holding some moisture. And it's that moisture that's going to hold the peat together while you work with it. So once you get it squeezed out, so you want to spread it out in a rough circle, and you want to not have thick clumps and thin clumps. You want to try to have it evenly consistent in terms of how thick it's spread. Fill in the holes. And you want to have enough peat, and you want to have enough sphagnum so that you can wrap it up around the soil ball. It's better to have a little too much moss than not quite enough, so I'm just going to add an extra little layer around the edge here. And the next step is to work on the soil ball. So I'm going to get out a clump of the soil, pack it just a little bit so it holds its shape, and I'm going to put my leaves in place. And I'm just rinsing the extra soil off. And I'm just thinking about how they would look coming out of the top of a flower pot. I don't want them to be too crowded. Once you get several of them in place, put a little bit of soil over the top to kind of hold them. And then we'll add some more. And if it falls off, that's all right. It's going to be in the clay and in the moss anyway, so. This part's kind of fiddly, but it's worth taking your time to get it right. You want it to be a nice little arrangement of leaves. And you may think this is a lot of things to put in it, and it is, but a Pathos grows in runners. So each leaf with a root attached will make a runner. And if you only have 2 or 3 leaves in it, you'll only have 2 or 3 runners, and it will look kind of sad. So each one of these little leaves I'm putting in is going to produce a runner, and it's going to be a really nice hanging plant. So now that I've got them all in place, I'm going to add quite a bit more clay, and I'm going to shape it into a ball. So you set your ball right in the center of the sphagnum, and then you just wrap it up around the soil ball. And if there's enough moisture in the sphagnum, it should stick to itself fairly well. Just a gentle squeeze will hold it in shape. If yours is a little bit too crumbly and it falls away, just dip your hands in the water and come back to it, and it'll be enough to get it going where it needs to go. If this is your first time making a kokedama, you're going to want to stick to a fairly small ball. The bigger it is, the more difficult it is to shape it. And you want it to be where you can hold it in your hand and it holds together. This is the ideal situation. If you've got a spot with not enough moss in it, you can always add a little more while you're running the string around it. But this one's ready to wrap. So I'm going to get my twine. This is just jute twine. And I'm just going to toss the ball on the floor because it's easier to deal with that when it's out of the way. And if you take the ball in one hand and wrap with the other, it works fairly well. You don't have to tie it in a knot, but you do have to wrap it over that first little end string pretty snugly so it will hold itself into place, like that. And you want to wrap from one side all the way around to the other side. And when you get to the top, you can turn it just a bit. And that gives you a little bit different angle. And if you keep twisting and turning, it'll put a nice pattern. And you notice it's trying to fall off over here. That's all right, just kind of snug it back on. And if it does fall off, when you get back around to it, you can add some more moss right under there. And how much string you put on it, that's entirely up to you. It can be completely random, or it can have a nice pattern. It's completely an individual decision. You want to be careful not to wrap a leaf under the string or get a leaf underneath the moss, because that'll just set up a situation for rot. So try to avoid that. If you got a piece that's blowing out, not looking very round anymore, just tuck it back in. And you just shape it as you go. I'm working on a second layer. You can see how the strings crisscross. And I'm going to stop after I get to the end of this second layer. And this is going to be a hanging kokedama, so I'm going to put the hanger on next. I'm just going to take a look at it and make sure I've got it finished. And so for the hanger, you want it to go under and start coming out the other side, and then we're going to run it under two of the strings for the first part of the hanger. And it's impossible to do with gloves on. So I'm going to measure the length of my hanger. I'm going to cut my string. And I'm going to run the first one under this X toward the bottom of the kokedama. Pull it all the way through. And then I'm going to catch one at the top on the same side where there's an X. just like that. And then I'm going to bring it up in between the leaves and turn it to the opposite side. I'm going to catch it at the top. And as long as it's an X, it doesn't matter if it's 2 or 3 or 4 strands, as long as they're crossing over one another, that gives it the best stability. So about that long, and then I'm going to take it to the bottom. So it's in place, and then I'm going to tie it off on the bottom. And the knot doesn't have to be fancy. As soon as this twine dries up a little bit, it's going to shrink, and that knot is not going to come undone. So it just needs to be just a simple tie it off. Pull it tight. Just like that. So it's important to catch it on the bottom, at the top, and then at the top and at the bottom. That keeps it from turning upside down when you hang it. And so there is the Kokedama. It has some mud on the leaves, so I'm going to want to wash off the leaves, clean it up a little bit, make sure I've got lots of room. And oops, it looks like a leaf got tangled up in here, so I'm actually pulling it out. Got to be careful with those leaves, because if you get a leaf stuck in there, it's only going to rot, and that's not going to be helpful for your plant. But you don't want the twine crowding the plant, and it's not. There's plenty of room for the plant to grow. It does balance very nicely on its string. And so this plant will thrive in a very shady position. You can hang it indoors in bright indirect light. You can hang it outdoors on a plant stand or on a tree limb, as long as it is in the shade. It'll be great. Now, keep in mind that this is just a moss ball and that the water's going to evaporate out of it very, very quickly. So let me show you how to water your Kokedama. You need a bowl of water, and you simply set it in it. And you're going to let it soak for 5 to 10 minutes. And once it has soaked, you pull it out, and it will be dripping. And you want to just very gently squeeze it, just enough to make it stop dripping. And you're going to want to set it out in the open and let it air out a little bit. And then you can hang it back up once it begins to hold its shape. And if you pay attention, you can tell how much moisture is in your Kokedama by how much it weighs. When it's wet, it's hefty. You can feel the weight of the water. You can also feel the moisture when you touch the Kokedama. It either feels wet or it feels cool and kind of damp. And as long as it's damp and cool on the outside, you don't want to water it again, because the moisture holds into the peat moss on the inside. Remember that peat moss is like a sponge, and if it's damp on the outside, it is wet on the inside. So you want to wait until it's completely dry and crispy on the outside, and it's very lightweight. You can tell when the water's gone because it is just very lightweight. But another thing to pay attention to is the turgor pressure in the leaves, because you're going to know when it's running out of moisture when the leaves start to droop. As soon as you see the leaves making this little drooping pattern, that's a sign that you need to water it right away. Now the Pathos can take very little sunlight. It can grow in almost no sunlight. So this little Kokedama could be positioned in many places in the home. It could also be given away as a gift. What a unique gift to give to a friend or a neighbor, a little plant that thrives without a flower pot. Now the Kokedama is an ancient art form. in Japan, and it's sometimes called the poor man's bonsai because it was originally created in order to grow bonsai plants without having to buy the expensive pots that go along with them. And so the moss ball that surrounds the roots keeps the roots very compact and very self-contained, and you can still do your pruning of your bonsai to make it be the shape that you want it. And then when the roots begin to outgrow the ball, you actually take it out of the kokedama, you prune the roots, you put it back into a new kokedama shape, and it's the same process that you would do taking care of a bonsai. But it's an interesting point when it comes to taking care of a plant. The kokedama is not meant to be a permanent situation for any plant. It's something that you will use for a season or two, for a year or two, and once the roots start to outgrow the kokedama, you're going to have to take it apart, give it some more soil, prune the roots if you need to, and then decide if you want to put it back into a kokedama, or maybe you just want to put it back into a pot. This is the art of kokedama, the art of growing a plant without a pot, of providing a growing environment inside of a moss ball displayed perfectly to showcase the beauty of your plants. I hope you've learned something new, and I hope you share this with a friend, and I'll see you next time on The Handcrafted Garden.